Now in this struggle for the mind, this mortal war for immortal values, one of our great weapons is, I think, the shield of facts and the sword of logic. And our next speaker is one indeed who knows well the shield of facts and the sword of logic. For 25 years he has been an investigator. He has had patient research, precise research. He has been a brilliant journalist. He has been an editor. And it is indeed good for us that we can hear him this morning. As an anti-communist speaker, he knows very well that often we conservatives feel like a lonelier Daniel in a den of fiercer lions. But this morning I can assure him that he is a lion in a den of friendly Daniels. And so it is my honor and my privilege to introduce to you this morning that lion, Frank A. Capell.
Reverend clergy, fellow Americans, my purpose in being here and my purpose for many years in devoting the greatest portion of my life is to bring to the American people a message of truth concerning the threat to our country, the threat from within. Our people are well aware of the fact that the communist conspiracy has armed itself for the ultimate destruction of its enemies, but so few recognize the truth that the threat from within is the same as the threat from without. It is all the international communist conspiracy, and every country that was taken over first from within. I will not ask you to accept anything I say because I have said it, but simply implore that you keep an open mind, and I will give you the documentation and the facts. If you will bear with me, you will have ammunition to use in spreading the word, because it is only by a grassroots movement, by a plan of each one teach one, that we are going to save our country. We cannot at the present time depend on radio, television, or newspapers, but we have found it can be done by word of mouth, and this is the only hope that we have. Now, many people have asked me through the years how I became so interested in the subject that I'm willing to go around the country, and I don't make my living this way. I have a business. It's small. It gets smaller every year. But back in the 1930s, I was in Westchester County. I had been a tightroper, criminal investigator, and I was at the time chief investigator of the criminal division of the county of Westchester, which is an area with 1 million population adjacent to New York City. We were approached by the FBI, who told us that they had more investigations than they were able to handle with a number of men who were trained, and would we undertake to do work for them in the county of Westchester. As a result, I established in the county the Bureau of Subversive Activities, and in that capacity supervised the investigation of over 5,000 individuals and organizations. But apparently they had foresight, because not too many years afterwards, there came a day, and all the statements I make, I say knowing that it's being tape recorded, and you may make notes, you may challenge me on anything I say, because if you tell the truth, if the people will accept the truth, then they will know what has to be done. There came a day when they said orally, we have been asked not to investigate communists anymore, and the orders have come from Washington. And so I had 5 undercover men go into the Communist Party. It wasn't easy to get them in, but we did. And they made reports weekly. And I studied these reports, and then at times I was able to look in the faces and talk to the people on whom I had read reports. And so communists were entirely different than I had thought they were. They weren't the long-haired, wild-eyed soapbox orators from Union Square. They were businessmen, they were educators, they were clergymen, they were scientists. They were people just like you and I, and they had a dedication to their cause, and they worked hard at what they believed in. And they had a deceit that was almost impossible to detect. Yes, the FBI knew apparently what was coming. It wasn't too long after that when one weekend they went into the Office of Naval Intelligence at 90 Church Street, and they had built up a very fine anti-communist card index system, and the files were completely destroyed. And not too long after that, they went to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, and those files too were destroyed. And the FBI came to our office and borrowed our reports and copied them and put them back into the file account. Now, I would like to set, if I can, after Father Van Grohl's talk on God and country, which was the opening theme, a second and a necessary theme to establish beyond any question of doubt that there is a threat from within and what is the strength of the enemy, and to use facts and figures, not opinions. Because if you recognize the fact that there is an enemy, then you will know there is much to be done. What proof do we have? J. Edgar Hoover has said there are 10,000 communists. And the enemy used this figure over and over again in an effort to convey the idea that the party is fragmented. It doesn't amount to anything. Why, the worker in the people's world is printed on the cheapest of paper, but they don't point out that other communist propaganda is printed on the finest of paper with the finest of printing and artwork. The reason J. Edgar Hoover says there are 10,000 communists is because these are the number his men could identify if required to do so on a witness stand. If he gave higher figures, they would only attempt to discredit the FBI. But we do have some ways of figuring out. For example, the communist publications that are printed regularly in the United States, particularly the foreign language papers that so few people know about. You know about the Worker and the People's World and the Guardian, but the various foreign languages, there is one in ever so many different languages. For example, the Worker is printed twice weekly, but the Morning Freiheit is the Jewish communist paper in New York, is published daily. And so the total circulation, as supported by sworn affidavits of the publishers filed with the Post Office Department under the regulations of second-class mailing privileges, shows that 250,000 people regularly buy communist publications every week in the United States. This is not Communist Front, left-wing, or slanted. This is actual communist publications. What else do we have in facts? The AFL-CIO expelled from the family of labor a group of unions in 1950 because they were completely controlled by communists. They have the opportunity of coming back if they would clear up the situation. They have not chosen to do so. These unions have their own indoctrination programs, their own publications, which are pro-communist. The membership of these unions at the present time is 365,000. Doesn't sound too much like 10,000. In California, I use this example because it is a dramatic one. A man by the name of Holland DeWitt Roberts was running for head of the education department of the state of California. Dr. Roberts was a well-known communist. He had been exposed in their own state in 1953 by the Senate Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities by sworn testimony. In 1956, Dr. Roberts was identified again in sworn testimony before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He was a constant and prolific writer for international publishers, a communist publishing firm. He was assistant director of the California Labor School, a cited communist training school. Nevertheless, in 1958, 400,000 people in California voted for this communist and wanted him to head up their education system. Let's bring it up to date. Just last month, in the city of Los Angeles, in one section, a man running for office, for supervisor, one section of one city, he ran on the Communist Party ticket and got 33,000 votes. In San Antonio, Texas, on the 27th of December, 1963, The Attorney General of Texas raided the home of the Secretary of the Communist Party together with 2 assistants and 3 peace officers. The man's name was John Sanford, S-A-N-F-O-R-D. Texas, according to the best information available, had 500 known communists. They seized among his belongings a confidential contact list of communist sympathizers and fellow travelers. On the list, 10,000 names and addresses. Dr. Bella Dodd, who at present time is very ill, may not last too much longer. I'd ask you to remember her in your prayers. A very close friend of mine said that her parents came here from Italy with 9 children. They wanted to have a better opportunity for education, perhaps a better life. Her parents sent her to Hunter College because it was free. There they made a communist out of her. She said, I did my best to make a communist out of every student who came into my classroom. And I had 300 students a year. But at the same time, I had 1,000 other teachers under my supervision in the city of New York alone who were members of the Communist Party and who were doing the exact same thing. Now, the Teachers Union was one of those expelled by the AFL-CIO, and they were barred from representing teachers in the city and state of New York. But in 1961, through propaganda and agitation, they got back onto the ballot. 2 of the people who were most responsible for bringing this about was the newly appointed Secretary of Labor, Arthur Goldberg, and a former Assistant Cabinet Officer, Anna Rosenberg. And so they got back onto the ballot. So years later, long after Bella Dodd had left the party, they were back on the ballot. How many people wanted a communist-controlled union? In 1961, 2,500 teachers wanted a communist union in preference to any other. The following year, in 1962, the Teachers Union held a huge anniversary affair at the Hotel Americana in the Grand Ballroom. Over 3,500 people in person came to pay their respects. Among those in the audience were state senators, assemblymen, university presidents, and so forth. Some couldn't come in person. They sent telegrams of congratulations. Among those were one Supreme Court judge of the United States, the governor of the state of New York, the mayor of the city of New York, the superintendent of schools, the president of the Board of Education, and a long list of politicians and university presidents. How much had things changed? Bella Dodd came back to God and country through the efforts of Bishop Sheehan. It took him 5 years to cleanse her mind. You must understand this communist philosophy, this Marxist philosophy, penetrates deep into the brain, and people don't break from the party as quickly as they say. Let me tell you that from people who have defected, from people who have come forth and told the truth, we know that in the last 25 to 28 years, over 1.5 million people joined the Communist Party. How many of them broke because they sincerely rejected Marxism? We don't know. We do know many broke for various reasons, because of the downgrading of Stalin, the butchery in Hungary, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, many, many different varied reasons. Many because of the discipline, because the party is demanding in its requests that people do whatever they want, change their name, change their address, change their occupation, and so forth. What we do know is less than 2% of the 1.5 million have ever come forward to say an unkind word about the Communist Party, to go to the congressional committees, to speak out about the very conspiracy that they themselves were a part of. Surely this is the first sign of good faith, would be to warn their fellow Americans that they too may not become dupes of the conspiracy. Now, Bella Dodd was lecturing in Westchester County a few years back. It was one of those depressing days when you feel that we're never going to win. And she mentioned that Senator Javits had gotten his start in politics through her at the request of the Communist Party. And this caused some excitement, as a result of which hearings were held before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. I would refer you to Part 43 of Scope of Soviet Activities of the Senate Internal Security Committee, or a book put out by the book mailer by Lyle Munson entitled For the Skeptic, in which you will find all of the testimony of Jacob Javits. In brief, Belladad testified, and Jacob Javits, when he was brought in, testified. His memory was extremely bad, but there are some things that they were able to bring out. One of these is that when he came out of the Army in 1945, he went from New York to San Francisco on a train to attend the UN meeting which was being formed at that time. On the train, he spoke to a man who it developed was Frederick Vanderbilt Field. He admitted talking to the young man. This fellow was a communist, millionaire communist, by the way, a Soviet agent, and was going out to cover the UN for the then Daily Worker. Javits admits having talked to him. Testimony showed that Javits was at the home of Louise Branston. Louise Branston's home was a meeting place for Soviet intelligence agents, for communist functionaries, and for Soviet diplomats, and that present on that occasion were some important communist individuals. The testimony and those hearings further show that as a result, later, Javits went to the office of Belladad in New York on 42nd Street, and she stated he was brought there and that the Communist Party were interested in furthering his career. Dr. Belladad had an assistant in the teachers' union by the name of Hyman Forstenza, Dr. Hyman Forstenza, doctor being for Doctor of Philosophy. She had previously testified that Dr. Hyman Forstenza was a communist and belonged to a cell in the Bronx. She stated that Javits came in and she had been told that the party was interested in furthering his career. It so happened that Hyman Forstenza had a brother who was the Republican leader of Washington Heights, an area in the northern part of the island of Manhattan. And so the brother was contacted, and it was arranged for Jacob Javits to obtain the Republican nomination in an area which was heavily Democratic. And so Javits ran and was elected. Belladad said that the communists had caused a rift in the Democratic Party, had them fighting among each other, and as a result, for the first time in many years, a Republican was elected. Now, if you question the veracity of Dr. Belladad in this case, let me refer you to the records. They will show that at the time of the nomination, Jacob Javits was not a resident of that congressional district. He lived on the Lower East Side of New York, and he was a registered Democrat. And in case you are interested in Dr. Hyman Forstenza, what is he doing at present? He is in charge of mental health of the state of New York. Many, many letters have gone into Governor Rockefeller, but it continues. But then, if you will recall, Governor Rockefeller himself admitted that he too was in San Francisco in 1945 when the UN was being formed, and he said the FBI came to him, 2 agents every morning between 7 and 7:30, and they briefed him on what was going on, because at the time Governor Rockefeller was an Undersecretary of State. And he has admitted they brought him evidence concerning Al Jahis, that they had the goods on him, that he was a Soviet espionage agent and a communist. And he admitted further that he did not turn this information over to the State Department nor to anyone else, because according to him, in the State Department, the FBI was looked upon as a fascist organization. Now, for several years, there had been complaints coming in from parents concerning indecent literature, pornography, degenerate-type writings and photographs in New York. And one of the men who I think is outstanding throughout the whole country is one of the speakers that you will hear during this program, Dr. Riley. But in any event, as a result of these complaints, which came in not only from people in New York, but from all over the country, because most of the communist literature, most of the pornographic literature have interlocking connections, and much of it is put out in New York. And so there was convened a joint legislative committee, and they held hearings for approximately 2 years. There was testimony introduced and evidence produced at those hearings, which was printed, to the effect that over 1 million pieces of hardcore pornography made in Poland by Soviet photographers, at which time they had released prostitutes and degenerates from prison cells for the purpose of photographing these things, and 1 million of them came into the port of Mobile, Alabama. Now, as a result of these hearings and meetings of the district attorneys of all of the counties of the state of New York, there was drawn up a bill which would have given the district attorneys the proper law by which to act, and it was passed by both houses, given to Governor Rockefeller, and he immediately vetoed it. And when this happened, the next issue of the Herald of Freedom, I wrote that it does not surprise me because his brother Winthrop has the largest collection of pornography in America. And people said, you're going to be sued because you can't prove this, and I said, yes, I can. Because in the divorce case of Bobo Rockefeller versus Winthrop, New York County Supreme Court, in questioning concerning his financial ability for a settlement for the child, it was brought out that he had spent $1 million for pornography, and thereafter he removed it to Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, there was a campaign that was going on pornography, and Postmaster General Summerfield was one of the individuals who was trying to keep it out of the hands of children. All of a sudden, it stopped, and many people who were interested wondered how this was possible. The program had stopped, and one day 2 congressmen got up on the floor of Congress and inserted into the congressional record the fact that there was a book written, and the name of it was Bartholf, B-A-R-T-H-O-L-F, Bartholf Street. The author, the new Postmaster General of the United States, J. Edward Day. Why do I mention pornography? Because there is a close relationship. Prove it? Yes. The publishing firm of Marzani, M-A-R-Z-A-N-I, and Munsell, M-U-N-S-E-L-L, of the city of New York, publish both pornographic type and communistic type books, and they have been doing it for many years, and you will find reference to this in the hearings of both the House and the Senate investigating committees. Marzani was a member of the Communist Party under the name of Tony Wales, and he also was an employee of the State Department. The next subject I will touch on is the Supreme Court. Earl Warren, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has no jurisdiction, nor should he have any interest in foreign policy affairs. This is the jurisdiction of the Senate and the House and the State Department. His is purely the Judiciary Department. Nevertheless, in 1962, he saw fit to spend a vacation with Tito in Yugoslavia. In 1963, he spent a trip and a pleasant vacation with Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. The next judge I have on the Supreme Court is Arthur Goldberg. Arthur Goldberg was connected with 4 communist fronts. It is a matter of record in the indexes of the House Committee. Not only was he a member of communist fronts, he was the president of one, the National Lawyers Guild of Chicago. No sooner was he appointed Secretary of Labor when he himself appointed an arbitrator for the Masters, Mates, and Pilots Union, Professor Walter Gellhorn from Columbia University. Professor Gellhorn had been identified as a communist years before by Louis Boudin's. In this position, he would be able to pass on complaints involving security matters as pressed by ship owners in our merchant marine. But I think a striking example with regard to Arthur Goldberg was the case, and those of you who have heard me before, bear with me, because these are things that are very important for our anti-communists to be able to tell to the people who are skeptical. Because they can be documented. Everything I'm telling you now will be documented. Can be easily. Refer them to the New York Times Index, because all of these stories have been in the Times Index, as I will indicate. In New York, there were 3 strikes going on at one time. The concrete truck drivers, the milk truck drivers, and the orchestra of the Metropolitan Opera Company. As a result of the concrete drivers, thousands and thousands of construction workers of various trades couldn't cross picket lines and therefore were out of work. Construction was held up, builders were losing money, people couldn't get their houses that they thought would be finished on time. In the milk case, wives were standing out in line for hours to get 1 quart of milk because there was a milk shortage. In the case of the opera company, the orchestra wanted an increase of about $75 a week. The opera funds could not allow for this. But when the opera case hit the papers, Arthur Goldberg came tearing down from New York. Did he go to the concrete strike? He did not. Did he go to the milk driver strike? He did not. He went to the Metropolitan Opera Company and he negotiated and he negotiated. To this day, nobody knows exactly how he did it, but they sent out telegrams and cablegrams and they brought back all of the employees of the opera company. And they opened in the fall season exactly on the day they were supposed to. And in a box on the right-hand side was Arthur Goldberg and his party, and on stage was the Bolshoi Ballet from Moscow. The next I have is Felix Frankfurter. Felix Frankfurter has been connected with a list of communist fronts. You will find this in the index of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. But I'll give you an easier way. If you will look in the Reader's Digest of only 30 days ago, you will find an article in which Felix Frankfurter himself admits at the age of 15 he was in a synagogue. And he said he was in there and he looked around and he said, all these good people, these holy people are praying. I feel it's sacrilegious for me even to be in here. And he said he got up and he walked out and he has never set foot in a synagogue since then. And he made arrangements that no clergyman should utter a word at his funeral. William O. Douglas, Supreme Court judge, has been affiliated with communist fronts. Hugo Black has been connected with a list of communist fronts, but not always. Before he went into communist fronts, he was in the Ku Klux Klan. Leave it to the FBI. Isn't that what they're paid for? Don't you trust the FBI? Don't you believe in J. Edgar Hoover? This is what you hear. The next time somebody says, why don't you right-wing people leave it to the FBI? Subversion, communism is their job. Just remind them, you do believe the FBI is doing their job. It is the other people who are supposed to do it after the FBI leave off. They only investigate. That is all. They have no power of subpoena. They cannot even tell you, the American public, the things that they know about, that God willing they could tell you. But they must sign a statement that they can disclose no information they learned while in the job. But it's very easy for you to prove the following. In the 1953 report of the Senate Internal Security Committee hearings, you will find that in the case of Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Harold Glasser, and a number of other communist spies and agents, the FBI had been sending warnings for 7 solid years. Repeated warnings, sometimes 35 separate reports pointing out that they were communists and spies, and absolutely nothing was done by the Attorney General or by the State Department. When you did learn about it, it was through a congressional committee. Always remember that. Nothing was ever done by the Attorney General or the State Department. So you see, you cannot leave it to the FBI. They are doing their job. It is the other people who are not. Now, Gus Hall, as General Chairman of the Communist Party, who are dedicated to overthrow our government by force and violence. The Communist Party at the present time, for the most part, are not doing the work themselves. They have formulated a plan which has been checked through trial and error, so they are now getting Americans, misled Americans, to do the work for them, and they are staying in the background. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the 1930s, Gus Hall was in Ohio. He had come there from Minnesota, and there was a wave of strikes against business firms, industrial firms. They were organizing. And there was communist direction. There was no question of doubt about this. And there was violence. People were beaten up. Cars were overturned and set on fire. Several homes were bombed. And it became necessary for the governor to call out the National Guard because the police could not cope with it, nor could the sheriff's office. And one of the officers who was placed in charge was a young lawyer of fine repute who became Speaker of the House of Representatives of the state of Ohio. His investigation and those of his men showed that 5 individuals were responsible for the violence, and they were taking their orders from Gus Hall. They all signed detailed confessions and threw themselves on the mercy of the court, as a result of which they were sentenced to terms up to 10 years in prison on felony charges. But in the confessions, they said they got the materials from a warehouse. And in the warehouse, they found large quantities of dynamite, other explosives, machine guns, and plans for blowing up waterworks, railroad bridges, power stations, and so forth. Gus Hall was not available at the time. He was a fugitive. Months later, he appeared before the judge with 5 lawyers, asked for a change of venue, said he couldn't get a fair trial. The judge agreed to it. The case was moved to another county. Months later again, he appeared with 5 lawyers and the district attorney. And the district attorney consented to the motions made by Gus Hall's lawyer. First, the lawyer said, my client, Gus Hall, is willing to plead guilty to a misdemeanor, while the underlings were serving felony prison terms. And the judge said, that sounds all right to me. And then the attorney said, why, he's even willing to pay a $500 fine. And the judge said, I'll accept it. And they turned around and walked out, and 4 months later, a check was sent in for the $500. You will find all of these details in the hearings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities for the year 1938. Unfortunately, our American people don't read.
They took her out, and after considerable difficulty in finding suitable arrangement, it's very happy news to know that she is now studying with one of the great coaches in New York, with whom at times Van Cliburn has studied. Not that I'm advocating his particular political philosophy, but certainly from the musical point of view, it is a desirable place for her to be. And after this had all happened, and while they were having not only difficulties as far as her schooling was concerned, but as far as their fellow townspeople were concerned, and having a very lonesome time in one of the near towns in New Hampshire, they were driving back one afternoon from some of the coaching with his teacher in New York. Her mother was driving, her father was
as a result of which he was arrested and incarcerated in a mental institution based on the affidavit of a psychiatrist who admitted he had never seen or spoken to him in his life. As a result of his friends, his attorney, he was gotten out of the institution. He was later examined by 3 psychiatrists in Dallas, Texas, approved of by the government, and they found him sane and of superior intelligence. The grand jury in the county where the alleged crime was committed examined witnesses. One of the witnesses was a former official of the FBI who was on the scene and who said that General Walker did not say the things he was accused of. To the contrary, he told the students not to violate the law. They had the right of assembly, a right of protest, but not to violate the law. Accordingly, the grand jury dismissed the charges. He was therefore innocent. The point I am getting to is that at the very same time that the head of the Communist Party was lecturing colleges on $5,000 bail, they placed General Walker under $100,000 bail. How can anyone justify this? $5,000 for a communist, $100,000 for General Walker. Why? Because he was an anti-communist. This is the only reason. How is this possible? When Lee Harvey Oswald, the admitted communist, was under arrest, accused of assassinating the President of the United States, he asked for an attorney, John Abt. John Abt is considered the top communist lawyer in America. He represents the Communist Party before the Supreme Court. This is why Lee Harvey Oswald wanted to have him. But did you know that communist John Abt was once Assistant Attorney General of the United States while he was a communist, in charge of the Antitrust Division, handling big business firms? My next subject is the Department of State. Now, the late Scott McCloud, who was a great patriot, died a little less than 2 years ago of a sudden heart attack. He was 47 years of age. He was a football player in college, former FBI man. He had tried to do a job in the security section of the State Department. In his case, they didn't remove him from office. They made him ambassador to Ireland, and in this way removed him from his duties. He came back in the early 1960s to testify before the Senate Internal Security Committee. One of the things he testified to was that in the period between 1947 and 1955, he had caused the dismissal of over 900 homosexuals from the State Department. Now, Otto Otepka has been trying, or had been trying, to carry on the work of his former superior, and he too found the wrath that seems to manifest itself when someone wants to be a patriot. I happened to be in Los Angeles, California for a couple of weeks until last week. I was out there with Otto Otepka when he received the Americanism Award, and he thanked the audience for it, the Hotel Statler Hilton by coincidence, and he said he was unable to talk to the people, things that perhaps he might like to say. I followed him, and I said, there is no one to stop me. I can tell you about what's going on in the State Department, and I will. And I now will tell you about what is going on in the State Department. If you read in the papers, you will find that there is a troubled situation in South Vietnam. This apparently was brought on somewhat by the assassination of President Diem. Now, you should know that this was a program promoted, I charge publicly, by the officials in Washington, and you read in the papers that President Diem committed suicide in the first story, was shot trying to escape in the second story. I say to you that I have the information from somebody who was with him the day before he died, and this person has given the information to other people as well. He knew he was going to be overthrown. He knew he would probably be killed. He got this information from the intelligence service of Chiang Kai-shek, because Vietnam did not have an intelligence service outside of their country. And in sheer desperation, not knowing what to do, to whom could he appeal for help? He was winning the war against the communists. He was doing a good job. But he knew his regime would be overthrown. And so they sent Madame New to the United States because they were told the American people are good. And if you get them the message, they will support you. And so she came here, and they spit at her, and they threw eggs at her. And so he was killed. Not with his own hand. He had gone to confession and communion, and he and his brother were at the altar rail praying when they were dragged out, beaten, spit upon, and shot in the back of the head. One of the men who was involved in this horrible thing is a man named Robert Barnett. Excuse me, not Robert Barnett, rather, but William Bundy. William Bundy, by the way, was formerly a high official in the CIA and has had his finger in the CIA for several years. Now, after the overthrow of the Diem regime, in an effort to pacify the American people, they changed the individual in the State Department who was in charge of Southeast Asia, and they put in his place William Bundy. William Bundy, for your information, is married to Mary Atchison, daughter of Dean Atchison. Dean Atchison wrote the white paper that the defense of Korea is of no importance to the United States, thereupon bringing into action the Korean War with the communists coming from North Korea into South Korea. The man in charge of Southeast Asia, William Bundy, was one of the individuals who raised the defense funds for Al-Jahis. His security file shows a photostatic copy of a $400 check given to Al-Jahis's defense. Al-Jahis's brother, Donald Hiss, is in the employ of Dean Atchison right now. Donald Hiss was an identified communist and accused espionage agent. The ambassador to the Soviet Union from the United States is Foy Kohler, K-O-H-L-E-R. Foy Kohler, while employed in the State Department in Washington, was arrested early one morning with his wife for public drunkenness, and I would not bring the subject up except that there was a second matter involved. He had over 50 secret State Department documents in his car. The police made a list, required an inventory, which was signed for by an official of the State Department, and this way we received the information. Now, As a result of this, he was brought up on charges, he was suspended. 30 days later, he was restored, he was promoted, he is the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Those of you who read the articles which appeared in the Journal American and some of the other Hearst papers concerning the Soviet defector, Colonel Galinowski, written by Guy Richards of the Journal American, a former Marine Corps colonel, will recall that Colonel Galinowski made a number of disclosures. Among them were the names of a dozen Soviet agents in the State Department, 4 in the CIA, and several in the scientific community. Now, at the time that Galinowski decided to defect, he was a top Polish intelligence official. By virtue of his rank, he worked in close cooperation with the KGB, Soviet intelligence, and therefore was known and called by many to be a Soviet agent. Actually, he was a high official of Polish intelligence, but worked also with the KGB. He had 20,000 agents working under his jurisdiction. When he decided to defect, he contacted our people, and they told him to remain and pass information on, which he did. After a period of time, he found that his own name was supplied by someone in the CIA to the Soviet intelligence. But not having given his right name in the first place, he was still safe, but he decided to make a break, and he took a plane to West Germany and thence came to the United States. He gave information to the CIA in Washington. On one occasion, he started to go into an interrogation room and found in the room a man who was to question him, who was actually one of the Soviet agents. When the Soviets found that Galinowski had defected, they were fearful concerning a high American diplomat who was a Soviet agent. And so they surfaced, as the word is used, a man in order to throw a smokescreen. Man's name was Skarbek. He was an unfortunate individual who had allowed himself to be compromised by a 22-year-old Polish communist agent who was a call girl. They got photographs of him in a hotel and threatened to expose him to the government and to his family. And so he turned over minor information which was available to him to the communists. They themselves turned him up, surfaced him so that he could be caught. He was brought to the United States, and the headlines read Soviet, American diplomat, Soviet agent. He was tried, sentenced to 30 years in prison. It was later reduced to 10 years. But the important point which was not brought out is that the very same girl, the Soviet communist agent who compromised him, came to the United States to testify against him. And then when she was through, returned back to Poland. Her mission was accomplished. What they were trying to do was to take the heat off a more important individual whom Guy Richards referred to as E.S. in his articles, and I say to you that the man's name was Edward A. Simons, S-Y-M-A-N-S. And Colonel Galinowski stated that Simons, for 18 years, while a U.S. diplomat stationed in various parts of the world, was continuously a Soviet agent. I prepared a little memorandum which I would like to read for you on Edward Allen Simons, subject employed by the U.S. State Department and Foreign Service for approximately 18 years, was assigned in the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. He is the E.S. referred to in the newspaper articles written by Colonel Guy Richards of the Journal American concerning the disclosures of Colonel Galinowski, the defector. As a result of these disclosures, the subject was recalled to Washington, D.C. and permitted to resign. He thereafter obtained a U.S. passport and went to Europe, where he stayed for approximately 2 months. It has since been learned that after being dropped from the State Department Foreign Service, he was re-employed by the U.S. Information Agency and kept on their payroll until approximately July of 1962, at which time he was retired with full pension. Simons, who was born Simansky, resides at the present time at 252 Madison Street, Southeast Grand Rapids, Michigan. Telephone number 458-8533. It was reported he is at the present time employed by the city of Grand Rapids under a contract to write the history of that city. It is interesting to note that the subject was reported as having been given extensive lie detector tests while in Washington, which showed he was lying with regard to matters concerning espionage. No effort was made to prosecute. To the contrary, although the State Department issued a memorandum to the effect that he could never again be employed by the government where security clearance is necessary, he was in fact re-employed and eventually given a pension. By contrast, in Sweden, an Air Force colonel was arrested, charged with espionage for the Soviet government. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was not given a pension. You may be interested to know that that gentleman, using the term lightly, Colonel Stig Wennerstrom, W-E-N-N-E-R-S-T-R-O-M, testified in the court in Sweden that during the years 1952 to 1957, he was attached to the Swedish embassy in Washington, D.C. as an air attaché. And during that 5-year period, he engaged in espionage on behalf of the Soviet government, and he obtained many secrets concerning our Polaris missile system. Upon his transfer in 1957, on the recommendation of the State Department, he was given the Legion of Merit Medal. Now, Colonel Galanowski also gave information concerning a situation which shocks most people because patriots are hard to come by. There were 30 people from the Balkan countries who were anti-communists, and they agreed to work for the CIA to set up listening posts where information could flow to American CIA sources and thence to the United States. No sooner were the 30 posts set up when an agent within the CIA passed their names to the Soviets. All 30 were picked up, tortured, and put to death. Now, the State Department recently denied the fact that they had supplied call girls for Sukarno, and as a result, Paul Scott, the Alan Scott report, gave the details in his column. But there is, and there has been, a plan for many years where call girls are supplied by the State Department for visiting diplomats from any country in the world, and some of their best customers are from the newly emerged nations who were not familiar with this very entertaining practice that we have here at the taxpayer's expense. Now, those of you who have heard of what happened in Cuba may have not had some of the basic background which occurred many years ago. In 1948, Secretary of State George Marshall was present at Bogota, Colombia, at which time there was a conference for the formation of the Organization of American States. Present on that occasion was William Wyland. While the conference was going on, a revolution broke out. Bombs were thrown in every church in Bogota and in most public buildings. The revolution was unsuccessful. However, a popular political figure was murdered, and the people on the right were accused of having committed the crime. One man who was arrested was Fidel Castro. The dossier of the police department of Bogota, Colombia shows Fidel Castro, international communist. Now, in case anybody might think that people don't have access to the police department, therefore wouldn't know that Castro was a communist, let me point out that the President of the Republic of Colombia was on radio from coast to coast, and he wanted the people to know the revolution had been put down, and he mentioned Fidel Castro, international communist, by name. The following year, in 1949, the head of security of the Republic of Colombia wrote a book in which he detailed Fidel Castro, international communist, and his activities. So the fact that he was a communist was known in the State Department, and this was so much nonsense about is he or is he not a communist. Then how did it happen? Well, one of the things that influenced so many people who find it easy to follow the writings of the New York Times rather than develop their own information, they follow the writings of Herbert Matthews. And he wrote of the glowing visit that he had with Fidel Castro and how this was the George Washington of Cuba. And not only the people here were misled, but the people in Cuba were misled. But the Times knew better, because the very same Herbert Matthews who wrote these articles had previously written articles favorably about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the war in Spain, and he received an award for this from the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So it was history simply repeating itself. It was deceit. Just as I am talking to you here today, there were people warning the Cubans that there's going to be a communist takeover, there's going to be a communist takeover, and people said, don't listen to them, they're extremists. It can't happen here. Why? The United States would never allow it. If you go to the airport, every day you will see planes coming from Miami loaded with Americans, going to the beaches, the casinos. And we have an anti-communist government. These are extremists, don't listen to them. And they didn't listen to them. And some of them who waved their handkerchiefs out the window as Castro came down the Prado are now dead. The greatest success they can possibly have is to convince you that it can't happen, that there's nothing to worry about. Because if you believe that there's no threat from within, if you believe it can't happen, then you will do nothing. And if you do nothing, there will be no resistance. And if you speak out, you are an extremist. And therefore, they must silence you. And this is what is happening, and this is what has happened in every country that has been taken over. There was always the story given to the people, it can't happen here, don't listen to the extremists. Now we come to the question of civil rights. I talked to many congressmen, many senators, and many staff employees. I can't remember ever having found a single congressman or senator who sincerely is against civil rights. I have found many who question some of the portions of the Civil Rights Bill. Some of them feel that the propaganda which has been put out in this country and abroad is degrading to the American Negro. They think it's pretty nearly time somebody brings out the fact that there are more Negro college graduates, doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, engineers in the United States than in the whole world. In one of my talks in California last week, a Negro clergyman gave the invocation. After the talk, he said to me, you know, Mr. Capell, there are more Negroes who own cars in America than the total number of cars owned in the whole Soviet Union. And he said, but these things just aren't told. There are a couple of points I'd like to bring up. They debated for 3 weeks in the Senate over whether or not Americans accused of criminal contempt should be allowed to have a trial by jury. This was a serious thing, and many senators believed in trial by jury. But let me point out that Adam Clayton Powell, a congressman who has been affiliated with 114 times with communist fronts, fantastic record, a record showing that he knowingly raised money for the communist publication, The Worker, that he was a speaker officially for the Communist Party, so forth and so on. You can't think of a communist front that Adam Clayton Powell has not been affiliated with. Yet in a Baptist church in California, in front of 1,500 people, and the UP and the AP, UPI and AP, he made the statement that when President Kennedy showed him the Civil Rights Bill, he said he didn't like it, and he said he rewrote it. It was then given to the Committee on the Judiciary, where the chairman himself has been affiliated with a number of communist fronts, and there it was supposedly debated and examined, and yet on certain amendments and on certain occasions, congressmen put into the record that they had 1 minute of debate. Now, this is a fantastic thing that so many people who are talking, as Father Van Grohl said, breastfeeding, are not nearly as interested in the civil rights as many of the people who are being maligned. For example, in the city of New York, two men, Bayard Rustin and the Reverend Milton Glamerson, two men were able to get 450,000 people to participate in a school boycott against the city. And the city of New York has a mayor, Mayor Wagner, who certainly is an accepted liberal. The members of the Board of Education are for the most part liberal, and they were working diligently to do everything they could to meet the demands. Nevertheless, they had this boycott anyway. And who are they? Well, a man who is editor of The Worker and a member of the National Committee of the Communist Party, the name of James Jackson, has been under surveillance by the police, as he should be, being a leading official. And while they had him under surveillance, they noticed him meeting frequently with Reverend Glamerson. Bayard Rustin is a man who was convicted on a homosexual charge in California, but who went to prison for a 3-year term rather than serve in the armed forces of his country, who had been in the Young Communist League, and who, as far as we know, has never said an unkind word about communism. But here you have two people who were able to get 450,000 good people, mind you, good people, to do this. It reminds me of the communist fronts during the 1930s, 1940s, when, according to the House Committee on Un-American Activities records, a total of in excess of 10 million people joined communist fronts. Imagine this, over 10 million people. Good people. Probably 98% of them wanted to do something for their fellow man or their community. But they did join communist fronts because they were disclosed later to be communist fronts. And what's the most important thing of all is they paid from $2 to $10 a year dues. And they gave the communist conspiracy from $20 to $50 million to use to destroy themselves with. It's almost unbelievable, but we pay for our own destruction. Are we fighting communism? Do we fight communism by giving millions of dollars to Tito for a different brand of communism? If the Soviets have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the United States, certainly they have one or two that can reach Tito in Yugoslavia, and they could bring him to his knees in short order. The answer is that Yugoslavia is a foreign aid program of its own. There were many people in the Soviet Union who, wanting the world to know that communism doesn't work, sabotage farm machines with sand, emery powder, anything, to let the world know that they can't even feed their own people. It's a failure. And so we give wheat to make up for it. These are things that is very difficult for people over there to understand. Now, historically, in 1922, at Bridgman, Michigan, the state constabulary raided a top meeting of the Communist Party. As a result of this raid, many records were seized. They were examined for almost a year, and a book was written. The name of the book is The Reds in America. The man who worked on the documentation, a young lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover. What did the book show? It showed communists had infiltrated into Hollywood, into churches, schools, into every area of American life. It even showed that some congressmen and senators were meeting in a hotel in Washington to take direction and advice from the Communist Party. People always say, well, now, you're talking about communists in the churches, prove it, prove it. We get these wild statements. By coincidence, the same year, 1922, the raid took place. A book was published by Bishop William Montgomery Brown, Protestant Episcopal Bishop of North and South Dakota. The name of the book, Banish God from the Skies and Communists from and the Capitalists from the Earth. He preached communism from the pulpit. He was eventually unfrocked. When he died in 1937, he left an estate of $450,000 to the Communist Party. Let there be no more nonsense about whether they have infiltrated into churches. Why wouldn't they infiltrate? They have a plan. The plan is world conquest. Coexistence is a ridiculous thing to entertain because they must have control of the world. They know this. The differences are ideological. The differences are not shall we be done in, but how to do us in. They cannot stop while they are free nations because these free nations might one day put them down. And so the end result is they are working towards a communist world. Not a single communist leader has ever denounced this plan. It is something they must have, and they have never given up the idea of it. Now, Americans have been subjected to brainwashing. I'm going to try to go through a few more of these rapidly because time will run out. Dr. Pavlov, who ran the experiments on dogs, conditioned reflex, ran some on human beings. And he found a plan that works that they have used. If you create a crisis, everybody is tense, and you let it die down, and you create another crisis, and you do this over and over again. You block the Autobahn, it gets in all the headlines, then it dies down. Eventually people become oblivious to crisis. And so the first thing you know, you look in the paper and you see they've torn down an American flag and trampled on it, or they've thrown a bomb into the embassy, and people say that's terrible, and they turn the page over and completely forgotten about it. You see? Just as the propaganda of giving people a wrong label. In Algiers, Ben Bella is known to be a communist, and his followers, the revolutionary group, are communist. It is a communist-sponsored movement supplied with arms and so forth by the communists. The people who were fighting against Ben Bella were known as the secret terrorist army. The word was repeated over and over again on radio and television. Secret terrorist army. Well, since they are the only two that were fighting, those who were fighting Ben Bella would have to be the anti-communists. They were the patriots who were fighting for the homes, their families, their grandparents before them. They had been there for 135 years. They were fighting for their home, for what they believed was their country, that they had been told was their country. So you see, the anti-communist patriots were the secret terrorist army. Just as when you read in the paper, you see over and over again that Castro, I'll start first with Batista, who was there before him. He was referred to as a monster and a murderer, but he didn't kill Castro when he had him in jail. He turned him out on the intercession of the Archbishop of Santiago, and when he took over, he expelled the Archbishop of Santiago. But in any event, Castro is known in the papers as Dr. Castro. Khrushchev is Premier Khrushchev. Sukarno, President Sukarno. Tito, Marshal Tito. But Batista is Dictator Batista. Franco is Dictator Franco. You see, what is the reasoning behind this? In your mind, it registers. The anti-communists are listed as dictators. The communists, the butchers, are given titles so as to imply that they are statesmen, marshal, premier, doctor. And this goes on constantly, and people don't observe it when it's happening. The good communists and the bad communists. Now, all over the world, incidents are occurring. Wherever you look in the papers, you will see in the free world headlines, incidents the United States has put into an unfavorable light. American diplomats are arrested, flags are torn down, bombs thrown in embassy, unarmed planes shot down. What is behind it? I say to you, we're getting closer to the end. They've had a coalition on orders from Moscow several years ago of all the various factions, the socialists, the Trotskyites, the communists. They now share the platform together. They used to clobber each other, now they work in unison. But the few nations who are still uncommitted are being told that you can't depend on the United States for your defense. You can't expect them to help you. They can't even defend themselves. They're a paper tiger. You can spit at them and they will take it. Therefore, come over to our side before it's too late. And if many of them do, you can't blame them, because this is precisely what has been happening. Until we can get rid of people in the State Department, and I have printed in the Herald of Freedom over 45 security risks. No one has challenged them. The facts are there. Almost everything I have told you during my talk is in my book, which is called The Threat from Within. Almost everything I mentioned is documented, plus a great deal that I have not documented. It would be well, if you're so inclined, to pick up a copy when you go out. It's $1.50. It will give you the answers to many arguments raised by people as to whether there is or is not a threat from within. Now, all over the world where the communists have control of people, they are waiting for their freedom. They're held in by walls, they're held in by barbed wire and machine guns. Nothing is done in the United Nations to obtain their freedom for them. And as long as people can be held in by machine guns, as long as the United Nations troops, as occurred in Katanga, went into Catholic churches and pulled the crucifixes from the altar, and not too long ago, Protestant missionaries murdered, one with her hands chopped off, while in the presence of United Nations troops, while these things are going on, we can't say the United Nations is working. It simply is not working. Now, these people who are suffering under communist control are looking to us. We are the only hope, the only salvation they have. They are praying for their deliverance. They can't leave these countries. They're held in.
And until we do, there is no hope for them. And we will not be able to until we recognize that there is a communist conspiracy, that it exists, that our nation is in danger as long as these things are permitted, as long as we give aid to communist countries, as long as a person can get up and speak against communism and be criticized and vilified because he does this. Is this not the enemy? Do we not spend $50 billion a year to arm ourselves against the communist conspiracy? Then why not recognize it? Then what is wrong if we speak against communism, since we spend these billions of dollars and have 1 million Americans serving overseas, and we read in the papers where many of our people are being killed by communists? So surely it behooves us to do everything we can. If you believe what I've told you, and there are, of course, people in the audience who may not, but if they will open their mind and search for the truth, they will come to the conclusion that there is a threat. There is a serious threat. I know of no one who is well informed, people within the FBI and Army intelligence, naval intelligence, who is not concerned. Not that we can't win, but we have got to do it, and we've got to do it now. And you're not going to do it by getting articles in the newspaper or on radio or in television, and you're not going to do it necessarily by writing a postal card. You're going to do it by each one teach one, by bringing the message to the American people, the grassroots movement, which they showed in California in opposition to all the communications media, radio, newspapers, television, money unlimited. They were still able, with 40,000 people going around ringing doorbells, informing, they were able to show success. This can be done all over the country. Remember the formula, each one teach one. Now, in the charity of your prayers, remember, it isn't easy. I say to you, before God, it isn't easy to be an anti-communist out front. There's vilifications, there's abuse, sometimes on your family, it's hard to take. But there are people who are doing it. They are the Georges. They are the ones out front. They are fighting for all Americans, not just for conservatives, for liberals, for Catholics, for Protestants, for Jews, because all people will suffer under communism, as anyone can tell you who has come from a country as a refugee where they have taken over. So those out front need your prayers. The people like Robert Welch, Billy James Hargis, all of the speakers that you see here, the people who take the brunt of the abuse because we are out front. Finally, in the charity of your prayers, pray for the misguided people in Washington, in our government employ, here and abroad, who are aiding the communist conspiracy, that God may open their mind and let them see the truth and the light, that they may come back to their God and country before it's too late, because they don't realize that they too are expendable. Thank you.